I mentioned these advanced glycation end products, which is just a way of saying that when we cook something, it's a compound that generates from cooking at really high heat, and it's non-enzymatic glycation and the oxidation of those proteins and the fats, which then increases oxidative stress, inflammation, and glycemic stress. We see a lot of long-term damage from the ages that we're eating, which are the advanced glycation end products, in our diabetic patients, as well as in our asthma pathways. So when I talk about cooking, what that really looks like is rather than broiling your meat at a very high temperature for a shorter amount of time, what if we stewed it? That significantly reduces the age's exposure. Or I love a good fried egg, but what if I scrambled it instead? That would decrease my exposure to ages. So there's very small ways that we can make changes to our diet and actually decrease our exposure to these oxidative stress inflammatory drivers just through cooking. So these ages and this bacteria, let's think about how our probiotics, which are the little squigglies in our gut that are good, and we want the most of them and the most diversity of them. And then the prebiotics, which are kind of like the fiber that feed them. So they kind of form this nice synergy, having probiotics and prebiotics. Well, the probiotic bifidobacteria and lactobacillus, they actually produce an enzyme called glyoxylase. And this glyoxylase breaks down, or Pac-Man chomps up, the ages that we're consuming and protects us from bacterial infection from something such as E. coli or salmonella. Because if we do get a bacteria infection, these further contribute to our inflammatory process and increases the amount of ages because they're secretors of ages. So the question is, well, what do we do, Raquel? And the answer is eating more probiotics. And you can find those in not only our plants, fruits and vegetables and grains, but the Lactococcus lactis is one of the lactobacillus strains that was found to be the most influential in the inhibition of the process that starts the ages, so that it reduces the amount of ages that are in our system. And the sources of milk from this particular strain, if you think about lactobacillus, we normally think of milk products. So Lactococcus lactis is from the sources of milk such as fluid milk, cheese, yogurts, kefir, those fermented products. And all of this is so important to have that synergy between those probiotics and prebiotics, because the ages actually activate the dendritic cells, which are causing the inflammation in asthma. So putting this all together, just summarizing those two slides, the formation of ages happens when we have high temperature, we're cooking a protein, and those reducing sugars, the fats, the proteins, they're creating the ages. We know how to detect them from food processing, but we still have to think about, we noted that they're there, but how do we get the message across that it's really important that we try to lower those? Well, we teach things like this, right? We teach about transportation in our asthmatic pathways, our obesity pathways, our gut microbiome. And we also need to name the things that can come from not decreasing our ages. So diabetes, I mentioned with that glycemic index, but also orthopedic diseases, intestinal diseases. It gave me pause thinking about, oh, IBS. Could this be something to consider for that GI condition? And the prevention will come from eating more raw fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and adding in those inhibitors like we talked about with the yogurt, the fermented milk products, or milk in general. So with that, if we're looking for those inhibition products, we talk about fatty acids in the diet. So omega-6s are more pro-inflammatory with their leukotrienes and their prostaglandins, where the omega-3 fatty acids are more protective or anti-inflammatory because of their end products. And looking about for what is the ideal ratio, again, it goes back to, okay, Raquel, that's great, but now what do I do about it? So the ideal ratio in our asthmatic patients is a 5-to-1 of omega-6 to omega-3. 10 to 1 is actually known to have adverse consequences towards asthma. So there is an ideal ratio, but as always, there's always going to be a little bit of wiggle room. But 10 to 1 was adverse consequences. So we may recommend a marine-based supplement that can be algae-based or fish or shellfish, or encourage the eating of fish and shellfish from wild-caught sources. Where the omega-6s, when we get into ultra-processed foods, you'll see that it's really hard to avoid them. Sunflower seed oil is like all the rage these days, and it's in a lot of products that we typically would be purchasing. So fiber is something else that we were talking about from more fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Why is fiber so important? It actually modifies our microbiome in our gut, which then affects the dendritic precursors that we have in our bone marrow, because the fiber makes these short chain fatty acids that go into circulation. And then the short chain fatty acids go to the dendritic cell precursors in the bone marrow, and they also release into the lungs, and they're able to kind of deactivate or reduce the activation of local dendritic cells. And then they're producing butyrate, which then will have no Th2 cell activation, and it'll actually decrease the allergic pathways involved in airway inflammation, which I think is super cool. The idea of eating dietary fiber can actually not only impact our guts, but our lungs. So we really are what we eat. So fiber in the microbiome, if we look at the agrarian diets, so the farmers' diets, they're much higher in fruit and legume fiber. And that gave them more bacterial diversity in their guts. So I talked about the little squiggly guys in our guts being the diversity that we're looking for, or the bacteria diversity. So the more of the healthy bacteria diversity we have, which is what we saw in the agrarian diets, they have more of a predominance of the Prevotella, which is a healthy bacteria that we want in our guts. So compare that to our Western style of diets. They tend to be higher in fat and sugar, low in fiber. And then these opportunities that we have in our food choices, if we choose higher fat, lower fiber, higher sugar, it actually decreases those happy firmicutes, and it can, instead of metabolizing into short chain fatty acids, it actually increases the mucosa that's associated with enteric pathogens, again, affecting our lung and our guts. Then there's all these fad diets. And a lot of my patients will ask, why are you so against these diets? There's a lot of reasons, right? It's not sustainable. It can be really expensive with all the branded food. But truly, the heart of it is that if we're following a animal-based or keto-based diet or low carbohydrate, then we're not getting the things that we need to increase the firmicutes, and we're actually increasing the bacteroidetes. So long-term adherence really puts you at risk for colonic disease. So the way that we can offset this, now that we know what it is by eating more fiber through fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and even if a patient or one of the ones that you're working with is gluten-free, there are still brown rice, sweet potatoes, lots of other sources of fiber-rich starches and grains. So if we were looking for that ideal microbiome, like we saw in the very beginning, we would want to increase our bifidobacteria through fermented foods, and our soluble fiber through oats, nuts, seeds, the real sunflower seeds, not the oils, and more of our legumes. And then psyllium husk is a typical fiber that can be supplemented. So now let's go to these ultra-processed foods that I've been alluding to. And we're talking about emulsifiers and the microbiome. So this is the definition, the regulatory definition of an ultra-processed food. And I read this to my kids because it really even like was jarring to me, and I just was wondering how they would respond. They're 10 and 12. So it's an industrial formulation with industrial formulation. It's not a food, it's a formulation with 5 or more and usually many ingredients. So the other ingredients include food substances not commonly used in culinary preparations. It's like some sci-fi food that they're making. Additives whose purpose is to imitate sensorial qualities of unprocessed or minimally processed foods. disguise undesirable qualities of the final product. So emulsifiers, humectants, non-sugar sweeteners. My kids had me read it like a few times and they were like, oh my gosh, like this is bizarre. You're saying that it's like not food. So then their question was, well, what kinds of things are they? And there are a lot of the boxed foods that we're eating or a lot of the processed foods that we're eating. And these emulsifiers, like specifically if we're talking about ice cream or margarine, like the oil-based bread substitutes or butter substitutes, we see that polysorbate 80, xanthan gum, carrageenan, and CMC. Those may be destroying our epithelial mucus layer in the gut and altering our gut microbiome composition permanently. So some of these studies have shown that there's a permanent effect through eating these emulsifiers, and it can increase inflammation. So lastly, I want to touch on the healthy weight, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. And I appreciate you taking your lunchtime to hang out with me and learn about this. So healthy weight, here we can see that the obese non-asthma on the far left has less of the cytokines, where the obese asthma patient has more of these inflammatory cytokines. And then the non-obese asthmatic patient still has asthma, so there are still some cytokine inflammation, but it's less than the obese patients with and without asthma. And why do we think that this might be? Well, it's the stress that we're putting on our body with the extra weight. Much of it can be fat deposition. And when we look at the microbiome in an obese and asthmatic patient, or just an obese patient, the nasal microbiome exists, as well as the lung microbiome, our mouth, and our gut microbiome. So what we're seeing here in the black and the red is this increase of proteobacteria and streptococci bacteria, which we saw to be prominent in the asthmatic lung. But the patient who's not obese with asthma does not have this predominance. The same would go for your oral and your gut. But interestingly, in our lung health here for the obese non-asthmatic, we were seeing a little bit less of the streptococci. So the importance of a healthy weight, I cannot stress enough, but a healthy weight truly is different for everybody. And talking with a patient to say, where do you feel most healthy? A lot of my patients are obese, and our goal is never to go from 290 pounds to 170. The goal is, hey, over the next 6 months, I think a good goal maybe would be 10 pounds. And then how are we going to get there? And what are the outcomes of that? You have asthma. We're going to pick foods that are going to help your microbiome for your asthma. We're going to help you pick foods that are going to help your gut microbiome. So talking through tangible goals with them, where I gave you guys a lot of science behind this, but making that science digestible for them. So is there a recommended diet? This phrase, an apple a day, keeps the doctor away. So there is a recommended diet, right? We can start in early life, and the early life diet increases butyrate production with those fermented foods, the fish, the seafood, and fruits and vegetables. That increases the butyrate, which will then decrease atopic sensitization, decrease asthma, and decrease food allergy. So we have a great opportunity to start very early in life to support our patients in their prevention. So food for thought, to kind of summarize, trying to reduce emulsifiers. You can do it individually, but we can also advocate with the food manufacturers, especially your group sounds large enough that we could maybe make a movement towards advocating. We want to always make sure there's adequate vitamin D in the diet, even checking serum levels, because that can affect inflammation. And more fermented foods. Kimchi is really great. I know it has a unique taste, but even small amounts of fermented foods can help. And increasing our plant-based proteins to about 30% of our daily calories. So thank you immensely for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Raquel. That was, I know that was a lot of information that you're distilling into a short period of time. So I really appreciate that. Um, anyone, if you have any questions for Raquel, you can put them in the chat and we'll make sure that we get to them. Um, in the meantime, Raquel, I was hoping that we could go back to something that you touched on. Um, and well, you touched on it in a couple different ways, but you had one slide in particular about the ideal microbiome and sort of
Yes.
like the juxtaposition between that and sort of like the typical diet of a or a Western diet, I think you had
Hmm.
called it. Um, and I was hoping that you could just sort of like return to that theme and talk
Sure.
a little bit more about like how um, fermented foods like the and also fruits and vegetables, like again, just how that pathway works to reduce inflammation and to make sure, especially for people with asthma, that um, like you have an opportunity to help your airways do what they want to do, which is
Yeah.
like help you breathe. So
So,
I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
sure. So thinking about when we're eating more fruits and vegetables and more fiber, one or for in fermented foods, the fermented foods specifically give us more of the happy gut bacteria. And then that in turn can create, we can have different sources of the fermented foods. It could be like soy sauce is considered a fermented food. So each of those different sources is going to, everybody's going to have their own little shapes to make our gut more diverse, which then makes us less susceptible to inflammation, whether it's for the asthmatic pathway or for food allergies. And fiber is really critical for inducing the production of the short chain fatty acids, which have a significant role in the dendritic cells, which are the active inflammation cells. So by eating more fiber and producing more of those short chain fatty acids, we have the opportunity to stop the allergic pathway. And that's significant. That's incredibly impactful to one's quality of life. Does it mean your asthma will go away? No, but does it mean maybe you're using your rescue inhaler less often? Maybe you're able to manage your asthma with less medications. Does that help?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have a question from Melinda here in the chat. Do you recommend any particular probiotics for children with asthma?
I worked in cystic fibrosis for a few years before I started in food allergy and asthma. And Culturelle is always the probiotic that we've used. It's Lactobacillus rhamnus, and that particular strain, or if you use multiple strains, but you can use the that one Culturelle strain in other probiotics as well.
Awesome. And let's see, we've got a couple others here. For patients with milk allergies, what sources of vitamin D do you recommend outside of vitamins?
Oh, yeah, I know that's really a hard question, right? Because vitamin D is coming from our milk sources. Um, so I ask them to go outside for 15 minutes a day at peak sunshine times and play. Certainly, when the kids are in school, that becomes harder. Other vitamin D sources, I look for vitamin D fortified foods. Sometimes that's the breads that they're eating. Some of the plant-based milk products or their yogurts also can be fortified. The issue is that we don't know the bioavailability of vitamin D in those plant-based products because they might actually be bound to some of the plant-based other ingredients outside of just the pea protein. There might be other ingredients that can bind the vitamin D. So yes, I am very pro vitamin, but I also love a good day in the sunshine.
Thank you. And we do have an evaluation link that was just put in the chat, a survey where folks can, if there are other topics that you'd like to hear discussed, you can put those in, or if you have recommendations for other topics where we're doing a deeper dive, longer presentations. And then Kay, actually, if I could have you go back one slide. Um, I do also want to mention, just before we end today, that we do have a conference that's coming up on May 15th, on long-term stress and mood, in asthma. Oh, I'm sorry, not on May 15th. That's the conference, the save the date that's there on World Asthma Day. So I hope that you'll join us. You can go to our website, chicagoasthma.org/events, and learn more about that or register to come to the event. But yeah, we'll be talking about long-term stress and how that affects asthma. Um, and yeah, the last thing I'll say, since unfortunately we're out of time, is first of all, thank you again, Raquel, for joining us today. That was an incredible presentation, and again, I really admire the effort you went through to distill a ton of information down into a short period of time. Um, and I'll just encourage everybody again to take a moment to fill out the survey before you leave. And thank you everyone for your participation. And we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this.